Hey, Brook Scholars, welcome back to Remote Learning with me, Mr. Scott. How are you? Happy Wednesday, hump day. Here we are, and today we're reading another story. Yesterday, as you might remember, we did some wonderful work thinking about the characters, what kind of characters we had in the story. We decided that Luke was a very respectful character based on the idea that he was always using nice words with his teacher, being very, very understanding about what was happening in school. Today, we're going to work on two different things. We're going to work on something that is a habit, and we're also going to work on a skill. Now, the skill you're familiar with, the skill is going to be retelling. However, you can't really do a great retell of this fiction story if you don't practice a really fantastic habit. And that is, of course, to visualize. Remember what visualization is? When you visualize, what does that mean? Yep. That means you have to picture what is happening, picture all the action that is taking place. Now, that's going to be especially important for today's reading because what's happening in this story is you have characters, but those characters don't talk to one another. And there's a lot of action, there's a lot of things that go on. So if you're not picturing this in your mind's eye while you are hearing and reading the story, it's going to be really hard for you to do an excellent retell. So think very carefully about the image and the picture that you have in your mind while we are reading, so you'll know exactly what's happening in the story. Okie doke, here we go. Swim, Baby, Swim by Mary Lester. One summer morning, a young blackbird clung to a cattail stem near his nest. His mother had woven the nest from fresh grasses, but it was now brown and dry. It hung crookedly in a clump of cattails on the edge of a farm pond. All right, where are we? One paragraph in, let me know, what are you picturing? What is the setting? Right, we are near a pond. You might remember that near ponds you have clumps of cattails. Now, that's not really the tail of a cat. No, it's a special type of plant that grows up out of the water of a pond. And what's happening in that particular cattail? You've got a young blackbird. You've got a baby bird, and the baby bird is in the nest in the cattails by the pond. See, I told you this was going to have to be a lot of thinking, a lot of visualizing. That's only the first paragraph. Here we go. The little brown bird held tightly to a stem and flapped its wings. On a nearby cattail, his father's yellow head glowed in the sun. Both parents clucked nervously as they watched their last baby learn to fly. The little bird blinked his dark eyes and looked around. He saw a world of green plants and sparkling water. He fluffed up his feathers. Then he flapped his wings again and gave a little push with his feet against the cattail's stem. All of a sudden, something really special happened. Off he went flying through the air. He wobbled as he flew across the edge of the farm pond and looked for a place to land. His toes grabbed a long, thin willow branch that hung out over the water. But the branch sagged under his weight. He slipped off the end and plopped down into the pond. Now the little bird's parents hopped around the cattails and called to their baby, but there was nothing they could do to help him. Then something special happened again. The little bird began to swim. He dipped his wing tips low into the water. When he pushed back with all his might, just as though he were flying, he moved the tiniest bit toward shore. As the young bird splashed his wings in the water, bright sparkling droplets showered on his head. The drops spilled over his back and soaked his last dry feathers. The pond looked calm and quiet, but the baby blackbird wasn't the only animal in the water, and some of the creatures, big fish, bullfrogs, and snapping turtles, would eat little birds whenever they had the chance. As the little bird struggled toward shore, a female bass, big fish, noticed the ripples he was making. Then the big fish saw tiny feet and wet, feathery wingtips coming toward her. She started to drift upward toward the struggling bird. Meanwhile, the bird's frantic parents were watching from the willow tree. They shrieked and screamed and darted about in the branches while the young bird swam on. By now, the little bird's wet feathers felt very heavy, and he was getting tired. He swam slower and slower. All the while, the bass kept moving toward him with one more powerful swish of her tail and a snap of her jaws. The wet blackbird would be hers, feet, feathers, and all. But just as the bass was about to lunge for the bird, an otter came streaking through the water. The fish zipped away from the hungry otter and went to find cover in the weeds. Off went the otter to search for the bass, so the little bird was safe from the fish. Phew! With a last push of his wings, the young blackbird reached the edge of the pond. He flapped out of the water and crawled up on the shore. There he dropped onto the damp clay soil in a wet heap of feathers. Now his parents cried wildly above him, squawking and shrieking. With luck, their noise would frighten away any enemies. As the young bird lay there, the rays of the summer sun warmed and dried him. He stood up and began to fluff out his feathers and straighten them with his beak. Then he stretched his wings and gave a little push with his feet against the damp clay of the shore. Off he flew into a clump of cattails growing on the other side of the pond. For the rest of that day, the little bird rested in the shelter of the cattails. Meanwhile, his parents still clamored and fussed, but now they also brought him all the insects he could eat. The next morning, the young bird flew away from the pond and headed for a marsh. There were plenty of dangers in the marsh, as he would soon discover. But for this day, at least, he would stay away from the pond. Very good, my friends. So, were you picturing all of the action that was going on? You may have noticed that we had animal characters in this story, and of course, those animals don't speak English, so they weren't actually talking to one another. So the author had to tell us that, sorry, the narrator, the storyteller of this passage, had to do a lot of work explaining to us this happened, then this happened, then this happened. There was also some really beautiful description that was in there as well, of course. Just before all that trouble started off with the bass, I really liked in one of the paragraphs here. This was after he'd gone in the water there. This paragraph here, as the young bird splashed his wings in the water, bright sparkling droplets showered on his head. The drops spilled over his back and soaked his last dry feathers. I really thought that was a beautiful description. I was hoping you were picturing all of that as we were reading. Okay, so we're about ready for our retell. And we're going to definitely make sure to include lots of character feelings as well as the problem setting and the solution. However, visualizing, taking the time to actually stop and think about what's happening and rereading if you need to is a very, very important part of reading. Hopefully, you're doing lots and lots of reading with your books at home. Even if you've read those books, I've finished reading that book. Yes, read it again. All right. As I've said before, some of my favorite books I've read many, many times, and every time I read it, I learn something new. I discover something, or my opinion about the character changes. Anyway, let's retell Swim, Baby Swim. This story takes place near a farm pond, actually. And in that pond, a family of blackbirds have made a home and they've made a nest. And the home and the nest is in a whole series of cattails, which are plants that grow out of the pond. And they had many baby birds, this couple, but we don't know exactly how many. But on this particular morning, they have trying to support their last baby bird as this baby bird is about to finally learn how to fly. It doesn't go very well. It doesn't. It starts well. The blackbird spreads his wings, launches off the cattail, and starts to fly. And then eventually wants to come to a rest. But then the branch that he chooses to rest on is not strong enough to support his weight, and so he falls off and he falls into the pond. And at first, this was a problem because now you've got a bird in a pond, and birds shouldn't be in ponds necessarily. They should be either flying through the air or hanging out on a branch or something like that. But it's okay because the little bird works out that if he does this flapping motion with his wings, he's able to kind of swim through and get himself to the shore. But one problem solved, and the next problem. What was the next problem? Yeah. well, just actually before the bass comes along, we've got the wings are getting really heavy because all of him is wet now, and then the bass starts to come along, and the bass would love to eat this baby bird, and the bass is swimming closer and closer and closer and closer and closer. What happened? Do you remember? If you don't remember, pause, go back and find it out. The otter. An otter saw the bass, and the otter was like, "Ooh, yummy, tasty bass." Otters eat fish, they don't eat baby birds, thank goodness. And so the bass is just about to get the baby blackbird, but then all of a sudden the otter comes streaking through the water, coming straight for the bass, and the bass goes, "Ah!" And the bass just runs and tries to hide somewhere away from the otter. So that means the bird is finally free to continue this swimming motion, get to the edge. Phew! Now, all this while, don't forget that the parents of the baby bird, they couldn't help him in any way. They couldn't go and scoop him up and say, "What have you been doing?" Oh my goodness. But they are clamoring and they're making lots of noise and sound, and they're very, very upset about this whole situation. But eventually, the baby blackbird gets to the shore, dries off in the sun, and is able to flap his way back home. And then it ends with talking about the following day, after that summer morning, the following day, where the bird is getting a little bit more skillful at being able to fly and flies off this time to a marsh. Very good, my friend. Well done. And thank you for joining me today. You know your job. You know what to do. You need to answer those multiple choice questions and the short answer. Snap a photo. Say cheese and then upload that work to Seesaw. Can't wait to see it. Thank you so much for joining me today, my friends. Okay, from me, Mr. Scott, the ultimate champion on the world's greatest YouTube channel. Thank you so much. Can't wait to see your work.